Morning and welcome to SIS and our panel on police reform. I am Carole Gallaher. I am the Senior Associate Dean here in SIS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to this talk today. I wanted to let you know that our talk today will be about an hour. We'll spend the first 45 minutes with me asking questions of our panelists, and then we'll use the last 15 minutes where people in the audience can ask questions through the chat box function. We also ask that you not record this event. We are recording it right now and we'll upload it to the SIS YouTube channel as soon as the event is over. So let me now introduce our panelists. Professor Wanda Wigfall-Williams. She's the chair of the Interculturalist and International Communication MA program here in SIS. She's an experienced interculturalist, conflict analyst, mitigator, practitioner, and she focuses on identity-based conflicts and communicating effectively across sectarian, race, ethnicity, class, age, and gender differences. As a scholar practitioner, she has negotiated with paramilitary leaders and militants, facilitated dialogues and focus groups in conflict zones, and worked to develop anti-human trafficking campaigns in Eastern Europe, West Africa, and Asia. We also have with us today Professor Cathy Schneider. She teaches on social movements, collective violence, and urban policing, criminal justice, and racial and ethnic discrimination in Europe, the United States, and Latin America. Her publications include the books Police Power and Race Riots, Urban Unrest in Paris and New York, Shantytown Protest in Pinochet's Chile, and Collective Violence, Contentious Politics, and Social Change, a Charles Tilly reader. Professor Jonathan Fox is an SIS professor and the founder and director of the Accountability Research Center, an action research incubator that focuses on transparency, accountability, and participation. He works with a wide range of social organizations, public interest groups, policy reformers, private foundations, and development agencies. His most recent articles have been published in World Development, IDS Bulletin, and the Journal of Peasant Studies. We also have with us Professor Chuck Call. Chuck is an SIS professor of international peace and conflict resolution. He focuses on post-war peace building, state building, democratization, and police and justice reform. He has conducted field research in Central America, West Africa, the Balkans, Colombia, Haiti, and Afghanistan. In 2017, he was a senior external advisor to the World Bank UN report, Pathways for Peace, Inclusive Approaches to Preventing Violent Conflict. Chuck has consulted for Human Rights Watch, the UN Development Program, and the European Commission. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. I want to start, since we are an international relations school, we of course focus on service as well, and think about what police reform looks like in other parts of the world. I want to start with you, Chuck. Peace processes often involve reforming the police. Based on your research in post-war Central America and Haiti and Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and South Africa, what lessons do you think we could apply here from those places in the US?
Thanks. It's good to be with you all. Thanks, Carole. I think I would, a lot of my research has actually been in countries where they have abolished the police, either through an invasion, such as happened in Panama and in Kosovo, or as a result of a peace process, where there was an agreement to get rid of the police and create a new police. And so, so I talk about that, but let me just give a little bit of context. First of all, I think as we are very much taken by the events of the last 2 weeks in the United States, which have had global repercussions, actually, I think, and may continue to do so. I think, it's not necessarily true that the lessons that we find in other countries hold for domestic policing, so we should just be careful about that. In the U.S., but I think it's clear that in the United States that, there's a lot of literature that shows how resistant U.S. local policing is to reform. So there's a book in 1960 by a guy named Sherman called Scandal and Reform, which shows how basically reform only happens when there's a scandal that forces police departments to do reforms, and they're shamed into it, and then the reforms are implemented with a lot of resistance and with not the great reach that they are initially designed. But to turn back to my research, I think one of the lessons is that there's a lot of the thinking about policing is something that's not just about uniforms. It's not just about how rules of engagement for public order, but it's also about everything. It starts with recruitment, training, composition, doctrine, oversight. Oversight bodies are very important, and community relations, among other things, right? So let me just say one or two sentences about each. One of the lessons that I have from divided societies in particular is that the composition of policing is as important and maybe more important for their legitimacy in society than their competence. And so a lot of technocrats, particularly in foreign assistance programs, think about police, reforming police is about like improving their capabilities and getting their training right. But in fact, in terms of how populations view their police, who is policing them? If indigenous peoples in Guatemala are policed by indigenous peoples, then it's a much transformed thing than if they are being policed by people they consider to be outsiders, right? And so I think that's one of the most important things that for people to understand. Training, doctrine, selection and doctrine is very important. And doctrine is really important if we think about rights and human rights, if we think about domestic violence. All of those things start when police are being trained initially, right? The other thing I'll say is that I think it's when one of the lessons that happened in some of these countries when they abolished police forces is there was a gap, there was a public security gap. And part of that is because you had a lot of armed people who were organized and armed and all of a sudden out of work. They didn't have jobs. And so in a lot of these countries, they became the source of criminal gangs and were recruited into criminal gangs. And so there was there's something that these countries want to think about. And you want to think about what happens when you actually put people out of employment in a lot of places. We're talking about abolition, for example, in these days, right? I'm not sure that would apply in the United States, but some of that's worth thinking about, right? The last thing I'll say is that I think transforming policing isn't just about policing. It may not even be mainly about policing, right? It's about changing state-society relations. There's a book by Paul Shavigny called Edge of the Knife, and he basically refers to the police are like the edge of the knife, the police relationship to society. It's where the state comes into contact with society in its most violent way, but also in its most pervasive way. And I think that, but it's about state-society relations. And one of the lessons that we found is when you change police, but you don't change prosecutors or courts, then and the laws that govern policing, then it doesn't really go very far. The other thing is, I'll say for an example from Haiti, social expectations of what police are is incredibly important. And so having people think about what their concept of policing is and the purpose is really important for thinking about policing. In Haiti, people criticize the new civilian police force because it didn't come and beat people up, because that's what they had come to expect when they created a new police force in the mid-1990s. So I'll stop there. I could go on, but I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Chuck. I think the edge of the knife is an interesting way to capture what the RUC was like in Northern Ireland, Wanda. I know you've done work in Northern Ireland during the Troubles and post-conflict. What can you tell us about police reform there? You know, after the conflict ended with the peace agreement, the RUC was replaced with the PSNI. What did they do? What else did they do? And what worked and what didn't work there?
What they did prior to the final signing of the multi-party agreement was to identify a person who is going to be charged with being the police ombudsman. Now, at first blush, it sounds like that person would be on the side of the police. But what the former RUC had was a police force that was completely made up, or let's say 99% made up of Protestants. So Protestants governing Catholics, not a pretty thing, particularly at the height of the Troubles, but even before the Good Friday Agreement and immediately after, it was a challenge. So Nuala alone, who they appointed her, and she began to really dig into what everybody sort of talked about in whispers about the collusion between the RUC and Protestant and some Catholic paramilitaries. No one wanted to put this down in writing, of course, because you're not supposed to talk about anything in Northern Ireland. And you definitely want to be careful about what you put in writing because it may re-escalate the conflict. So after many death threats, she actually she and her team put together that there were murders carried out by the RUC and various paramilitaries, Protestant paramilitaries. hits put out. And she was, I knew her well. I know her well, she's still around. She had to send her family away. But what they uncovered was just masses of information as to how deep this went and the kind of work that they wanted to do to transform it in a way that gave it legitimacy and credibility, not just for Catholics, but for everyone, Protestants as well. So it can't fire everyone, and they didn't do that. But what they did decide was they were going to do a 50-50 split so that, and all people would have, all police officers would have appropriate training. One of the pieces that I worked on had to do with training in mixed tradition housing estates. And a housing estate is just a fancy couple of words to talk about projects. And so often there would be a mixed tradition family, Protestant Catholic, living in a Protestant housing estate. And so they were subject to abuse by their neighbors, by whoever. And the police would never come. Or if they did come, it would be far too late. And so Nuala really led the charge on that. And bit by bit, she got buy-in from not only people who thought in the same way that she did, but people who really were interested in equitable justice.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you know, I think she really forced a reckoning too among the Protestant population who always said there's no collusion. And she showed there was a lot of collusion, and it really forced people to take stock of what had happened. And that in fact, some of the murderers they were protecting were UVF and UDA men killing Protestant kids. Yeah. Thank you, Wanda. Jonathan, I'd like to ask you as an accountability expert, what do you think accountability would look like in the typical American police force here?
Thanks, Carol. First, I should say that accountability it's a difficult idea because it means many different things to many different people, and we all think we know it when we see it. And now we're seeing a new mass movement against police violence in the US, contesting who gets to decide what counts as accountability. And so first, as a step towards pinning down the idea, I suggest we distinguish between reactive approaches and preventative approaches to accountability. And when I say reactive approaches, I mean focusing on ending systemic impunity and imposing real sanctions on abusers. And here we see the US legal system and union contracts designed to protect violent police from prosecution. And over the years, we've seen many different efforts with civilian review boards to create an alternative for grievance redress, but most of them lack teeth. Their recommendations are usually ignored, and they've done very little in practice to effectively address impunity. And it's no coincidence that the lead perpetrator in Minneapolis already had a long list of complaints, yet had not really suffered any consequences for his abuse. So if we contrast that to preventative approaches, they focus on making abuse less likely to happen in the first place. And here we have a long list of issues that are under discussion, like rolling back the lopsided war on consumers of drugs that are considered illicit, or using social service professionals instead of police to deal with mental health crises or the homeless. We have undoing the militarization of the police, and we saw the results of the militarization of the police every night for the last couple of weeks. There's the issue of ending the no-knock home invasions that killed Breonna Taylor, which violate the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution. We have the issue of tightening recruitment standards to exclude potential abusers from the police in the first place. And of course, much stricter limits on the use of force. And we also saw during the Obama administration attempts by the federal government to use more intense federal oversight with court backing to try to reform police. But that actually only reached a handful of the more than 17,000 police forces in the United States. And so I think in the big picture, it's hard to tell what works when so many reforms have been tried and have failed in the US. And so my last point will just focus on one example, which is body cameras. And body cameras are interesting because they they were widely seen starting a few years ago as a very promising way to use transparency for accountability. And supposedly police behavior was going to change if they knew they were being watched. But research now shows that that assumption doesn't actually hold up in practice, which has sent a lot of researchers back to the drawing board. And instead, the murder of George Floyd showed that it was a different kind of video that mattered, thanks to the brave 17-year-old witness, Darnella Frazier. And in the international accountability field, her watchdog role will be called independent citizen oversight. And this circles back to the question of what would it take for civilian review boards to actually have real teeth like investigative and subpoena power.
Thanks, Jonathan. Cathy, you've done a lot of research on the police. I wanted to ask you a question about one of the biggest problems I think we see in American policing, which is why are unarmed people of color more likely than whites to be killed by police in the United States? And also, is this a unique trend in the United States or does this happen elsewhere?
Right, it happens everywhere. There are populations whose lives don't matter, where there is little enforcement or protection of those citizens, either from state agents like police, but often also from violent crime. That the deaths, which is why Black Lives Matter as a campaign has so much resonance, even if you don't agree with all of their agenda. But in the United States, you're more likely to be killed by police if you are of color, if you are poor, if you are homeless, if you are disabled, if you're mentally ill. So there's a host of vulnerable populations that police feel empowered to kill because they're not going to be held accountable. One police officer I interviewed said, he was part of this drug force. And he said, we knew that we could get a lot more drug dealers if we invaded Columbia University. But we didn't know, if we were going to invade, we'd pick up somebody, and it turned out they were the daughter of the head of GM, and they would call the mayor, and the mayor would call the police chief, and my police chief would say, "What are you doing arresting her?" And in contrast, if we went into Harlem, there's all these kids, they're dealing on the streets, they're easy to pick up. And then the mayor can brag, "Look at these dangerous drug dealers I picked up." And so there is a huge responsibility from the society, who has been asking mayors and voting for mayors that say they are going to protect them from violent criminals. And the violent criminals are always pictured to be Black or Latino. The mayor then wants to show how strong he's been on crime. And he then puts pressure on the police, etc. One of the reasons we know it's about vulnerability is because it's not always white police that kill Black unarmed people. Two of the cases I worked with, it was Black police officers. And they were also not held accountable. So it is extremely rare in this country that police officers are ever indicted.
Cathy, the police officer that told you that story about going on to Columbia and getting GM manager's daughter, was he cynical about the whole process, or did he not? What was his reaction to that when he told you that? Did you think it was just that's part of the game, or did it make him angry?
Well, he was actually a Puerto Rican officer, made him furious. He left the department. He sued the department for racial discrimination. So there is a lot of tensions within police departments. It is not as if every police officer, as my friend Ron Hampton says, the police officers like to say, we're a family, and you don't, inform on your family. You keep it within the family, but they don't treat all officers equally.
Yeah.
In fact, there's another really interesting case in 1991 where two police officers were beaten almost to death One was Latino, Echeverri, and one was Black. I think his name was Sullivan. And the people who almost killed these police officers, leaving Echeverri with serious brain damage and an IQ of 79, were white police officers. In fact, one of those white police officers, Brosnan, had been Giuliani's bodyguard, and 3 years later, he was involved in killing execution style 2 Latino teenagers in the Bronx. And his mother was one of the people I interviewed. It took 22 years to bring Brosnan to trial for bashing almost to death and
destroying his life. Yeah.
He was never brought to trial for the killings of Anthony Rosario and Hilton Vega. In fact, Bratton, who's now suddenly being interviewed as the expert on police reform, savaged Rosario's mother and completely defended the police, said the children were terrorists or.
Right. Yeah. It's impunity. Yeah.
Right. It was absolute impunity. And in fact, it's not simply that if you hold police officers accountable, it's after the fact. What we found in New York is you hold police officers accountable, they stop committing the crime. And so what mothers of people who had been killed by police and other family members, together with the Justice Committee, decided to do in 2015, after Eric Garner's death, is they decided to do a massive campaign to remove responsibility for indicting police officers from the DAs who work with police officers, depend on police officers for prosecution of crimes, and are very unlikely to prosecute them. Yeah. And they asked the governor for a special prosecutor. Now the legislature, I think, just voted for a special prosecutor. What the governor did, let me just quickly, is he designated the AG as special prosecutor for every case in New York State.
Well, let me ask Chuck about following up on what Cathy's saying here and about the examples of impunity inside of police departments. A lot of studies in the US suggest that police officers' families experience greater rates of domestic violence than families that are not, that don't have police officer members in their families. Why do police departments let so many police officers accused of domestic abuse continue to serve? Is it, as Cathy says, that the police officers look at it as a family and you just kind of keep the circle around the family and handle the abuse inside? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so I think that the problem of there's the problem of domestic violence and police officers involved in domestic violence. There's some studies that are a little older, like 20 or 30 years old, that show that 40% of police officers back in the 1980s and early 90s had incidents of domestic violence in their past. I think that number's come down, and some other studies have shown it to be lower. But I think that, but most of the studies have shown that the incidence of domestic violence among active police is higher than it is in the general population. In 1996, there was an amendment, the Lautenberg Amendment was passed, that made that if you have a domestic violence misdemeanor crime conviction, whoever you are, you cannot possess a gun. But that's basically observed in the breach quite a bit. And there are gaps in enforcement of it, both in civilians and others, right? So this mass shooting that took place in Texas 3 years ago, I think, where it was a guy got a hold of an AR-15, even though he'd been convicted of serious domestic violence incident earlier. And so those are deficiencies of enforcement of some of those laws. But I think the bigger picture about policing that's relevant to both domestic violence and other things is these are organizational cultures, and these organizational cultures are deficient for the militarism they have, which Jonathan mentioned, patriarchy and machismo and sexism, as well as a lack of accountability and this culture of impunity and the brotherhood, the brotherhood of blue, where you don't report on others. And so one of the things that most specifically takes place in terms of domestic violence is that when police are accused of domestic violence, then they get the charge bumped down to something where it doesn't require them to lose their gun forever, for example, right? And the misdemeanor isn't enforced either. But I think the militarism is worth talking about because there's a book, first of all, policing in America, a lot of it has its roots 200 years ago in hunting racialized populations like indigenous peoples and escaped slaves. There's an interesting book that came out a couple of years ago, I guess, by Stuart Schrader called Badges Without Borders, that shows how U.S. counterinsurgency abroad in the 1950s and 60s and 70s in Vietnam and other places, a lot of people involved in that came back and transformed policing and training and doctrine in America, in American cities, that made it more militarized. And so you see this in the training, the emphasis on, shining boots and discipline and ranks, the names of ranks that are military terms instead of civilian terms. And so there's a whole culture around that reinforces some of that machismo and militarism. Finally, you have, and part of what is going on there with values of patriarchy that we have are, if you observe when a lot of these incidents of abuse that take place are about authority. And so abuses take place by police when you question their authority. They essentially feel that they have a right to exercise violence in order to exercise their authority. And that is about social values as well as the training they get. I want to flag this, an article that came out by Rosa Brooks in the Atlantic just in the last couple of weeks, called something like Stop Training Our Police to Be as If They're Military. She is, I knew her when she worked at DOD under the Defense Department during the Obama administration, but now she leads a project on police innovation at Georgetown, and which ironically was the place where we had this center in the car barn in Georgetown, where a lot of training of foreign police took place along these lines. But I think that the way that training takes place in the academies is crucial to that machismo. And so I'll stop there.
Thanks, Chuck. Wanda, I wanted to turn to you and ask you, Chuck's talking about these militarization policies. Cathy's talked about, the sheer impunity that often happens. What do you think are the most egregious policies that police forces currently have on their books that should be eliminated immediately?
Well, the first one would be these chokeholds, these illegal chokeholds that officially are off the books, but they're still being taught. And although I didn't want to watch the film of Mr. Floyd, I looked at it again, and there was something about the intensity in the police officer's eyes of, no, I'm not gonna, you're challenging me, and I've got the final word. So why teach something that we have documented is going to kill people? Why do we do that? And why don't we charge those people? One of the other issues is the use of pepper spray, and pepper spray really doesn't cover it because it's a wide range of different kinds of toxins, and industrial grade. So everything hurts. You can't breathe. If you have asthma, those kinds of things, or any kind of respiratory problems. And if you had none, you will after you're sprayed with that. Why are we using that? That happened here in DC over the last couple of weeks. And the force lied until reporters and regular protesters said, here are the canisters. Oh, those must have come from Antifa. No, they came from police force. So that's another component. And why are we pulling people, or the police pulling people over for a busted taillight when frequently the taillight's busted out by the police officer as they approach the car? So it's just an excuse to pull someone over, and the damage that it does to a community is immense. It's one thing, and it's a horrid thing to kill an individual, but that community has its soul ripped and re-traumatized again and again and again. because they see it in the media, they hear it, they say, when is it going to stop? And it does. Something that you said, Chuck, I think it was you, about this goes back to slavery days and post-slavery and what happened in this country and in most post-colonial countries, that certain people were not considered people or human. And once you've othered someone that to that extent, then you can do what the hell you want with them with no worries about responsibility or taking responsibility or making restitution or punishment. You don't have that anymore. So there's another piece of legislation in New York. I think it's 50A, I think 50A. And that is to protect the privacy of all police officers. So if they have a repeated history of excessive force in arrest, and this officer killed Mr. Floyd, did have that. He had 18. He was only charged, he was only talked to about 2 of those. We can't get that information easily because the unions worked hand in hand with the legislators. And so it's still on the books. Cuomo says he's going to repeal that. We'll see. I don't think it's that easy to repeal. But when you have a law that says, no, this is secret, how can there be accountability?
Cathy, you look like you want to say something. Let's get you unmuted.
New York State Legislature just voted to repeal it. And it looks like the governor will sign. So it's on its way out. The New York State Legislature just voted a host of reforms that activists and families have been asking for, and that was one of them.
That's good news. So this brings me actually to the next set of questions I have, and I want to really sort of get into a little bit about the protests that were related to George Floyd's murder and also Breonna Taylor. Jonathan, I want to turn to you and say, why did the protests related to George Floyd's murder spread so quickly and so far? And maybe also why Minneapolis? I'm just curious if you think it had anything to do with that particular city. And you may not know, but if someone else does, you can jump in after Jonathan talks.
Well, that's a great question, Carol, and researchers are going to be pondering that for a long time. After all, clearly violent police abuse isn't new, and it's not even new for it to be caught on video. And we have the shocking, dramatic case of the asphyxiation of Eric Garner, and we can go all the way back to Rodney King for the power of visual evidence. So we really do need to think about what's different about now, and I'll just mention 3 kinds of factors. The first is the context, and some organizers are reporting that the context is different because of COVID, and there are several elements to that. First is that there are a lot of people who are at home and have more time to both consume and discuss news and social media. Some wonder about the intergenerational dialogue as 20-somethings are back home with their parents with time to talk. We'll see. Another element of the COVID context is that it's clear to all how the epidemic is hitting African-American communities disproportionately, which reveals systemic racism in the health system as well. And the second kind of factor that makes this moment different is the trigger. And here we have the extraordinary video, which not only proves that to anyone that George Floyd was murdered in cold blood, it provides extremely powerful and compelling evidence that the crime was not just the result of a so-called bad apple, even for those people who would usually give police the benefit of the doubt. The video revealed, as Wanda was alluding to, the face of impunity. The video showed that the perpetrator had no fear whatsoever that he would be treated as a criminal for a criminal act. And more than stacks of studies, the video shows that decades of police reform had failed. And it not only shows an individual's racism, it shows systemic racism, an idea so powerful now and so widely accepted that in mainstream discourse, just amazing in the last 2 weeks, that even the Merriam-Webster dictionary is changing its definition of racism to include systemic racism, because a young woman reached out to them and amazingly got a response the next day. And they are busy in their dictionary committees deciding exactly how to phrase the first recognition that racism is not just a matter of individual beliefs and actions. This is a evidence of the power of the video. And another trigger was probably the Amy Cooper Central Park video, which revealed that the usually less visible side of racism and the threatening actions that come, the less visible side of racism in people who usually think of themselves as enlightened. And it showed how that kind of everyday racism is inextricably linked to the existential threat of police violence against Black men in particular. And then just a third kind of factor that makes this different is the accelerant. And you asked about the spread. Well, the police's own violent militarized response, repression of peaceful protesters, was an accelerant because it just provided more evidence that the police's use of force is unjustified and deliberate. It's not just a few bad apples, that it is systemic. And it sent the police repression, the unjustified nature of much of the police repression sent a message to the public that continued silence is consent. And that pushed, I think, many people off the sidelines and into the streets.
Thanks, Jonathan. Cathy, you spent decades working on policing in New York, France, Paris, other places. And you've talked to plenty of parents, spouses, children of people killed by the police. And the impunity continues. I think it was Jonathan that just said, you know, the reform seemed to have failed. So do you think it's just time to abolish the police?
Okay, so I have two answers to that. One is the reforms didn't all fail. Some of them had tremendous impact, and then the mayor was voted out and it was reversed. And so late 1960s, we were already having the first major reforms. So I don't think the book on in 1960 is relevant, because we didn't even have the beginnings of community policing until Mayor John Lindsay and Patrick Murphy, his police chief. And that police reform, which was coming out of the lessons of the Kerner Commission, in which Mayor Lindsay was vice chair, was that youth had to feel ownership in government, and police had to serve the community, and there should be an absolute restriction on fatal force. Lethal force could only be used when a citizen's life was in immediate danger, not when an officer's was. Because the job of the police was not to protect themselves, it was to protect the public. And Lindsay actually wanted more police on the streets, because he felt when police were alone, they were more likely to take lethal action, both because they were more likely to be nervous, but also they were less likely to be supervised. And so he put very, very strict restrictions on the police, but he also hired neighborhood youth as the peacekeepers. He created an array of community organizations for young people, summer programs. He made them communication liaisons to meet daily with the mayor's office to keep him abreast of problems before it arose. So the last national level uprising that we had in the United States was because nationwide uprisings are extremely rare. But we had one in 1968 after Martin Luther King. And every city exploded, but not New York. Largest city in the country at that time, quiet. Mayor Lindsay walked through neighborhoods in New York, unarmed, unguarded, talking to people. So policing reforms can work. Another great example, Nick Pastor in New Haven. He said what we have to do is change the incentive structure, turn it on its head. We have to reward work with community. We have to punish excessive use of force. He also said he did an interesting thing with recruiting. So the first thing he said, it actually had a much larger impact to recruit women than to recruit minorities, because you know that the police force is majority Black in Washington, D.C. He said he made as his deputy chief a lesbian sociologist from Yale. And my friend from the National Black Patrolmen's Association said when you were walking in New Haven those days, you'd see these big recruiting posters, and they would say, "Are you gay? Were you involved in Stonewall? We want you in the police." Or they would say, "Were you in the Black Panthers? Were you involved in free lunch programs? We want you in the police." So you can dramatically change the police. Unfortunately, Lindsay lost election, Nick Pastor was pushed out. So these reforms can have a radicalized effect, but they haven't lasted because of politics. We have to understand that policing is local and it's responsive to the local authorities. And if we want police reform, we have to do something about who we elect as mayor, as DA, as attorney general. Other kinds of policing reform that have worked from their limited, expectations is that in New York, the Justice Committee, and again, mothers and families of those killed by police, asked that the Governor Cuomo issue an executive order creating a special prosecutor. And he named the AG a special prosecutor. And in fact, 6 months after the AG was named, one of the district attorneys issued a non-indictment, and AG Schneider sued him. And after that, you had a dramatic drop in police killings of people unarmed. So they went from an average about 10 a year to 2 to 1. Past few years, we've had nobody killed by police. People have pointed out that police use all kinds of other forms of brutality. Yes, because none of those issues were addressed. The issue that
I want to say really quickly, if anyone in the audience wants to ask a question, please put it in the chat box. So Cathy, I would take from your answer then that what you're saying is that you don't believe we should abolish the police. What we need to do is reform it.
Yes, because first of all, people in poor communities don't want to abolish the police. Every survey shows that 70% of people in Washington, D.C. across race like their local police. But more importantly, people in poor communities also feel more vulnerable to crime. They're overwhelmingly the majority of victims of violent crime. And Danette Chavez, who lost her child to police violence when her child was caught in a crossfire and the police wouldn't allow his friends to enter the hospital with him. And he was left outside the hospital to die. And Danette is one of the most radical Black nationalists I worked with in terms of families. But when she gave a talk, she talked about bodies falling day and night, living in a situation of death and terror, children dying before they finish high school, nobody feeling protected, nobody feeling secure, that police were not investigating homicides, that 95% of arrests were buy and busts. She wasn't saying abolish police. They're asking for a dramatically different relationship with their police.
Mm-hmm. What do others on the panel think? Why don't I start with Wanda and then we can go to Chuck and Jonathan. Wanda?
Yes, I'm on the fence about abolishing police. I worry about the interim space between defunding them, abolishing them, and coming up with something new. Their role is to protect, to serve and protect and defend. So I would rather start with transforming it with these smaller steps, with accountability, goalposts or miles post, so that you have some sense of if it's changing, if the training is working, if it's accepted by the masses, say in a particular precinct, or if that precinct is continuing to have problems with excessive force. One way to look at it would be to look at all the civil suits for wrongful deaths in all the police forces in all of the states of the United States. And I didn't do it for all, but I looked at particular states, and I was shocked over a 10-year period how much money was paid out and what that money could do. For example, kids who are home after school, or maybe kids who have dropped out of school, who have nothing to do, so they're kind of just hanging out. That could really help communities. It could help poorer communities be lifted up in any number of ways. So I'd like to see some piloting of that kind of thing before we just say, no, we're going to defund, I don't know what it's going to look like, but it's going to be different. I don't think that's going to work. And I wanted to say a bit, Cathy, to you about Black police officers. My son was stopped and had a gun put to his temple at 16 by a Black police officer, and who cocked the weapon and threatened to, and he said, "Why are you doing this?" And his response was, "Because I effing can." And so the trouble, the problems that police of color face are internal and external. If either you're with us or you're against us. So what do you do? So that's just, I wanted to give a nod to that because I think it's important.
Chuck, what do you think? Chuck, what do you think about the question of abolishing?
I was waiting for the mute. Sorry. There's a lot here, and it's just just disturbing stories that you hear over and over, like the one of Wanda's son, right? And what I just want to respond to that, because I think what that shows is that ultimately juries have to be part of this movement, right? And I think until juries start holding people accountable, then impunity will continue, and the juries are us, right? And so that's one of the things that I find hopeful about this moment, is it seems that there's a potential broad shift of what counts as tolerance for police behavior right now in this country. I want to go back to the sort of abolition, and I think one of the things that there's a difference between, I think, as I've been reflecting about this abolition movement in policing, there's a long-standing abolition movement in prisons that I think most of us in the criminal justice community are very familiar with, and the abolition arguments about policing are more recent and less written about. And I think I just want to acknowledge there's a difference between how we think intellectually and substantively about this and the politics of the abolition movement. I think that just the abolition debate has just bust forth a breach in which we can have these conversations much more imaginatively and creatively and ambitiously than we could before 3 weeks ago. And I think that's really useful. And I certainly don't want to be one of those people who wants to throw water on what activists are saying and wanting and reinterpreting for them what they want, because I think there's a lot of activists that actually want to get rid of police forces altogether. I think that the most positive sort of a thing, I think that what that means for all of us is both activists and scholars is to think and write intentionally about what are and think systematically about what are the functions that police currently carry out that could be carried out by other entities that are not armed sworn officers. And I think there's a lot of those. I mean, everybody who lives in Washington, D.C. or drives in Washington, D.C. knows the police used to be the people who enforce parking, and now enforcement of parking is not done by armed officers anymore practically anywhere in major cities in America now. Thank God, right? I think technology gives us a new, you know, gives us a new horizons also, right? And so I worked as an EMT, a volunteer EMT firefighter for 7 years out here in rural Virginia. And I learned as a result of that how dangerous it is to stop on interstates. And yet we have state highway patrolmen stopping on interstates all the time to pull people over for speeding. Like, we can use cameras for enforcement of speeding like happens in Europe and not put officer and cars in danger because people are speeding. Like, there's much more danger from somebody dying from pulling someone over on the highway than they are from someone speeding by 10 miles an hour, in my view, right? So we need to think more creatively about what happens at the community level in terms of patrolling, in terms of responding to social unrest, in terms of responding to youth that can be handled and invested in through other means that we think about in peace and conflict resolution, for example, rather than handled by sworn officers. And so that's one of the things. And the other thing has to do with accountability and practice and norms about violence and militarism that I mentioned. So I saw someone had asked a question about recruitment and recruiting women. I think, one of the things that happened in these countries that got rid of their police forces and created new civilianized police forces is that, well, there's two things I want to say, sorry, one of them is when people do police reforms, they're usually responding to a particular problem in that context, right? So in Latin America in the 1990s, there was a response against militarization towards civilianization. In Eastern Europe in the 1990s, it was a response against communist partisan control and politicization of policing toward less politicized policing. In South Africa, of course, it was about white dominated policing, even though most of the policing was done by Black people and colored people, as they call them, right? And so it was about doctrine and racial, changing race. So, and then you have gendered and machismo policing, right? And so all of these things have to be actually thought about when you're thinking about reform and transforming policing, including in the academy and recruitment. So if you get rid of the police, you got to actually start thinking about who you're recruiting to do those functions and other things. And that's a real opportunity. I mean, I think it would be rich for people who have values of commitment to humanity and dialogue to be recruited into the kinds of functions, be they sworn officers or not sworn officers, to do these things. And so I think that is a whole frontier that needs to be talked about in terms of how we think about rethinking policing.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Jonathan, do you want to jump in really quick and say a few words on the abolition question, and then we'll move into the other questions on the chat in the chat box?
Yeah, I think it's really really healthy that the debate has opened up about how to reimagine public safety. It's clear that the problems are systemic, and that means that any kind of piecemeal incremental reform, the time is past for that. That would have made a lot of sense 3 weeks ago. And now our society and our political system has the opportunity to question a lot of the underlying assumptions. I think if any kind of police reform strategy, and there's no single magic bullet, needs to take into account the powerful forces against reform. Many of the past reforms naively underestimated the power of abusers to thwart the reforms, especially the more technocratic reforms or the reforms based on training. You can have the most enlightened training in the world, but the real training happens on the ground. Officer Chauvin was training 2 of the other 3 police who'd been on the job just a few days. So whatever happened in their training before, that day, he was training them in a new way. So there's no magic bullet. That we need approaches that are radical in the sense of going to the root. And I think it's wide open. What does abolition really mean? It's being debated. It's wide open. What does defunding really mean? Yesterday's New York Times op-ed put it on this debate about what does defunding really mean? Something is wrong, Christoph said, when 3 million American students are in schools that have a police officer, but not a nurse.
Yeah. Let me come over here to the chat box. So Cathy, we have a question from Sabrina Steele about your assertion that communities like the police. Do you think is that what you mean, that most communities like their police, or that they like them more than some people think?
They like them more than some people think. So what Ron Hampton used to like to say.
Can you tell us who Ron Hampton is too, Cathy, for people on the panel that might not know?
He's the founder of the National Black Police Association.
Okay.
And he's been active in the police accountability forces, and he's got a new organization right now. But he said, we're asking something simple, which is we want police to behave in Black and poor communities the way they behave in white, wealthy communities. They know their job is to protect and serve in white, wealthy communities. Why don't they know that when they engage with poor people of color and in those neighborhoods? And so what happens when you try and say something like abolish the police? You're going to get reactions from people who say, but I like the police. In fact, we have a moment here for the very first time where the majority of whites think that police should be held accountable, that police abuse the rights of Blacks. That never happened before because whites have a very good interaction with police. They always trusted their police. So we have to think about what we can do with this moment. The defunding means very different things. So police departments have become bloated. They become militarized. They become involved in schools, all the places they shouldn't be involved. So in New York, the Justice Committee has been pushing, they use the term defund, but what they're asking for is that $1 billion of the $4 billion NYPD budget go to communities, go to schools, go to service agencies, go to health services, help a host of other providers in neighborhoods. But mind you, they're asking when they say defunding is leaving $3 billion with the NYPD. So defunding means a lot of different things to different people. People use Camden as an example of defunding, but that was also Governor Christie, a Republican, intervening in Camden, firing local police forces, bringing in white police forces from outside. So the success of that, to the degree it was changing the mission statement for police, that they should be guardians rather than enforcers. Nick Pastor, the police chief in New Haven, used to say he wanted to change the mission statement to be nice. But part of those reforms were always enhancing the other kinds of organizations that provide services, and that police, if anything, should be a link between communities and those agencies. He used to say, for instance, in a poor neighborhood, every family has a problem child, drugs, truancy, whatever. If they think by contacting the police, the child will serve 25 years and they will lose their public housing, they're going to view police as an enemy. But if they think the police are going to help them have contact with different kinds of social services that can help their child, then the police become part of the community. In fact, the Palo Alto police officer, police chief, when he left, he said the biggest compliment he got was that people said to him that in Palo Alto, the police are part of the community. So what police did in these efforts were protect families, serve families, and that made police officers themselves feel safer and backed up in communities. So there are ways to think about radical reform and to build on things that have been successful without using a term that is certainly going to be used by the Republicans of the right to demonize the movement to change policing, to make us look like, unserious or threatening of public safety or not take. So we have a moment to do real profound change. And I think we should be very careful of the words we use. And I will say one more thing about activists. The loudest activists aren't always the most representative. And I've been working in poor communities, for 40 years, but in the United States and in France for at least 30. And when I was doing work with syringe exchange and harm reduction, we always saw the police as a big problem. But when I started interviewing people in those neighborhoods, they used to tell me, we don't have enough police. The police don't come when we call. They put us on hold for hours. There's nobody protecting us when we walk home. And so if you activists need to listen to communities. They have to also be where the communities are. And some of the activists I work with, like I love the Justice Committee, which was founded by the Young Lords, which was the Puerto Rican partner of the Black Panthers. It wasn't a reformist organization, but they see their role as working with families and pushing for the agenda that families care about, not simply being ahead of where the communities and families are.
So we're almost out of time. I wanted to see if anybody wanted to say one last word. Wanda, it looked like you had your hand up a moment ago. Do you want to say our last word before I sign us off?
Yes, I did. I wanted to speak to how we talk about Black communities, Black people, and white people. Typically, what I hear is poor Black communities. We're not Black people, white people, no people are a monolith. And it happens to upper middle class Blacks, middle class and lower class and poor Blacks. So I think it's a point that's often missed, that you can't escape this. As a well-educated woman and with a well-educated son, we can't escape. There is something that happens by virtue of the color of our skin, and that puts us in a box as a threat. And I think we have to talk about that and work through that a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Wanda. We have a lot of work to do. I want to thank all of the panelists for coming here and sharing their thoughts and their research and their perspectives. I also want to thank the participants that are here. We can't see you, but I know that you're here and we really appreciate you coming. And finally, one last word to Kate, Arian, and Amy Zawada, who are backstage, as it were, making sure that our mics are on, that our videos are on, and making sure that we kept our connection. So thank you all very much for coming, and we hope to keep doing some of these talks over the summer. Thanks very much.